As usual, I kind of want to start with the bombshell. So let's just get this out of the way. Code Vein, often called Anime Souls, is a Souls-like that is very heavily anime. And I liked it. If you don't understand why that's such a big deal, I am actually well known for not being particularly into anime, having tried many types of anime over the years, and not particularly being into Souls-likes either, I've actually played a whole lot of Souls-likes too, but there's only a few that ever really caught my attention and interest. So that one surprised me probably about as much as it did you. What's also interesting is this game sold extremely well, breaking the seven-digit barrier in terms of sales, which I've been talking about this a lot lately, the idea that what publishers seem to think good sales are versus what reality says good sales are tend to vary, right? 7 digits for something that is a relatively niche market like this is huge. That is incredibly good sales figures. So, a little surprised we haven't got a sequel since the game so clearly ends on a to be continued, but I don't want to get into that. What I do want to get into is the gameplay. It's your Souls-like, right? There's nothing new to add there. The weapons are interesting. I don't know how much this is true in most of the Dark Souls games, because I honestly wasn't doing that in-depth of a dive into the Dark Souls 1 through 3s when I was actually streaming them back in the day. But, speaking as someone who has streamed several recent ones, including Bloodborne and Elden Ring, I can tell you that the weapon variety is actually pretty nice in this one. See, good weapon variety isn't just making a mace that hits slower, and an axe that hits slightly faster, or a spear that hits farther. Good weapon variety, in my opinion, of course, is changing how the weapons actually attack. Assassin's Creed Origins instead of Assassin's Creed Odyssey. That's actually a bad example, but my point is, let's say I've got an axe, and this axe does... Here, hang on, I'll get my back scratcher here. We're getting all high profile here with our incredibly high budget show. Axe. Forward up right to lower down left, and then like second swing, and then third swing. So right off the bat, we can see the types of areas our attacks can hit, right? But then we pick up another axe. It is a different type of axe. This axe just does straight forward, just like this. So much more vertical reach and much more controllable, but you're never going to hit anything that is to either side of you. Third axe does something like this. These are actual weapons in the game, but they're not axes. But there's a third axe, there's a third weapon, which does like a swipe, full round swipe like this, big old cone in front of you, and then the vertical one, horizontal and vertical like that. And that's how you do good weapon design in terms of variety, is make it so that even though you have 5 swords, each sword functions differently. There's also other ways to vary it. Reach is an obvious one. So let's say you've got one axe, which is only like that far, but then you've got another one that can hit way over here, and there's all sorts of ways to do that. Again, this is typical Soulsborne stuff, but it's worth mentioning, because the weapon variety in this game is actually pretty good, and leans itself rather naturally into the Masteries system. Now, the Masteries is interesting because you've got each of your abilities, and you can use them, and it kind of sucks, because you have to be at or under a certain level in order to get full, let's call it mastery experience, in order to master a thing. Once you sufficiently master it, you have it. It's yours for any other class that can equip it. Some masteries have no requirements. Some masteries do. So there's a little bit of a mix and a match there with regards to what masteries you can carry onto other classes. But each of those masteries, before we move on to classes, each of those masteries falls under 3 general categories. There's, let's call them offensive spells, support spells, and then passives. So offensive spells, I say spells, abilities would be a better word, because this also applies to weapon abilities. Like there's one attack where you go swing, 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 spiral up, right? That's still one of the actives. But then you've got something that you just put a buff on yourself for the next 2 minutes, and now you hit harder, or you have more break damage, or you gain some of the health back after your hit, and so forth and so on. Those are all the buffs, and there's also debuffs as well. And there's ways to cleanse off debuffs off of you. You get the idea. Each of those classes, each of those masteries gives you, that capacity of that ability, and so you can have a nice mix of whether you want to cast, aka use an ability or not, whether or not you want to buff or debuff, or whether or not you just want to have a whole lot of nice passives, which are buffing your stats in the background. You are, of course, limited how many slots you can have, a grand total of 8 abilities, whether they are buffs or spells, and you can only have 4 passives at a time. So you got to mix and match a little bit for whichever situation you're in. The only complaint I have about this overall system is a lack of a loadout button. There should probably be a loadout system where you just do a pop-down and say, I want to load melee boss cracker. I want to load ranged boss cracker. I want to load trash leveling. Because there's some abilities which actually give you more experience and loot. There's one ability that makes it so you don't lose stamina as much while running. So we put that into the just running and so forth and so on, right? There's no loadouts, so you just kind of have to remember. Although the passives and the abilities remain the same, but the equipment does not. So it's whatever. Anyways, so that's all good. And of course the classes themselves, the codes in this case. The classes are interesting because I mentioned leveling, right? So the leveling weirded me out at first because you spend haze, in order to level, but you don't distribute it to your stats directly like you would in a typical Souls-like. Instead, what you do is you just raise your level and your stats in general go up because it always knows what your stats are going to be for each level, for each code. And that's the key part. The code you currently are determines what your stats are based on your current level. So just picture a giant chart. The rows are all the levels from 1 to 300, I think is the soft cap. The hard cap. And there's all your stats. And then each column is just a different class. So you switch to this class and you look here and that's what your stats are going to be across the board. So I looked at that like, but after a long time playing through it and with how incredibly easy and smooth it is to change classes and to mix and match masteries and weapons in order to decide on different builds, yeah, I actually really like this. There's a lot of build combos here. It's just different from what I was expecting and used to. And the classes themselves certainly lean really heavily onto magic, I noticed. I got a fairly large number of classes, not all of them, of course, but certainly a huge percentage of them. Tried out a lot of them. One of the things that kind of hampered me early on was for the sake of testing and reviewing, I was going out of my way to try every different class and build that I could within reason. I determined very early on that I didn't care for the casting, mostly because casting relies on lock-on. Now, before you jump down my throat, I don't really have a problem with lock-on, but it would have been nice to not have to lock-on. Imagine a reticule, and you could just aim it and say, I want to aim this spell over there, or I want to paint this spell on the ground over here. That little buff, that little change, which is totally coming in Code Vein 2, would have been a nice way in order to vary that up and make it more interesting. All of this leads to some excellent build gameplay, and the builds themselves... God, there's so many. We actually invited a few awesome people to join us for this run during the co-op thing, which was smooth and amazing. Check this out. You're not even going to believe me. You ready for this? So in order to do co-op, what you do is you open the menu and you say, please join me. And they open a menu and they say, I want to join them. And that's it. Okay, I'm being a little facetious. There's some provisos on top of that, but I was gobsmacked by how much more smooth and interface well designed that it was to be able to join a party member than it was in a game I've actually reviewed this very year, Elden Ring, where you have to paint the thing on the ground and wait, and it might show up and it might not, and they might get kicked for no reason, and all that other fun stuff. So that was nice. So get them in. Got to see a lot of different builds. Got to play Fashion Souls. Got to actually let my inner fashion geek be out there for just a few seconds. Get the rarity out there. Because I don't get to do that very often. And the point, though, is that with all these different builds and the other party members, what that does is something I've talked about a lot. The moment you add another party member is the moment you have exponentially increased the amount of tactics that the player can utilize. Sorry, I thought I heard something. So I've talked about this in Pokemon, for example. If you just make one tiny change to Pokemon and make every battle a double battle, all of a sudden, the tactical options for each combat and the number of different combinations and builds and options just explode. And it's the same thing here, because we have our party member, but we also have the possibility of having our AI party member with us, which we don't have to have, of course. It's optional, and it's awesome. So we have a party, and we have a party AI, and the party AI is surprisingly good. They know how to dodge, they know how to use abilities, they know how to heal, they know how to block, they know how to be efficient within themselves. I think they scale based on you, because they never really fell behind. They all have their different approaches, too. You've got your DPS glass cannon up in front. You've got your DPS glass cannon out in back. You've got your support. You've got your big old tank. You've got your roundabout all above. You've got your buffers. You've got a good option, a good spread there. And so no matter what you want to complement you can make that happen. Point in case, you can do what I like to think of as Guild Wars 1-ing it, where you have everything else designed to buff you, and then you just rush up and do as much damage as carefully as you can with whatever weapon it is of your choice, because you're just being carried by your buffs. That's actually how I got through the duo boss which, the duo boss, the ice lady, and the fire dude. Worst boss in the game, by the way. But that is how we managed to get through that, was with just buff, 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 buff. Okay, let's go. God. No cheats, by the way. Beat the game with no cheats. I know someone always asks that, so there's your info on that one. I already mentioned the co-op, of course. I already mentioned the party AI, of course. Most of the boss designs are excellent. Some of the levels are excellent. The cathedral sucks because it's samey and boring and hurts my eyes physically. I had a few people bow out of the stream or just stop watching the stream and start listening to the stream because of the cathedral section. Final Dungeon sucks. The latter stretch of the game really seems to show the threads. It feels like they were getting very rushed because the tuning suddenly starts being off and the dungeon design stops being there at all. And the encounter design goes away and the enemy design goes away. There's not a really good enemy variety in this game, unlike a game like, say, Bloodborne or especially Elden Ring, which has incredible enemy variety. This game didn't get any positives for enemy variety because it's just, there's the little dudes, there's the armor dudes, and then there's the big dudes. And that's kind of it. They barely vary up their weapons, and even those barely vary up their tactics. There's probably a grand total of 10 enemies in the entire game, from front to back. But, ignoring that little foible, and it just really starts to show when you get to the last dungeon, and they're just throwing out the same general combinations they always have at you, except they're trying to be more dickish about it. It's like, okay, cool. And then you get to, and the actual last dungeon is literally another samey, boring castle, which is just, okay, whatever. But then, as the whole outro was kind of going down in overall quality and started piling up negatives, several people in chat started being worried, oh god. And then we got to the second to last boss, I'm not even going to name, which was awesome. Now, I don't like to flex or brag, but I one-shot the second to last boss in this game. So what happened was we were getting close to when the stream was going to cut off, right? I usually chop off at 8 p.m. Eastern, so 7 o'clock, and I'm like, we're done here. This is the chop off point, and then I'm moving on. And we were like 14 minutes from that. And I was like, let's just go get up to the boss. Let's poke at him. I'm not really going to try. And then I beat him. And it was actually a really awesome fight. Like, it was a legitimately intense, fun, engaging, multi-phases, tons of variety of attacks, tons of variety of tells, some good jukes here and there, good recovery points. Just a fantastic fight. Easily the best boss in the whole game, in my opinion. And I'm like, okay, well, screw it. Let's push for it. And then we fought the actual last boss. That boss sucked. Total contrast. That last boss felt like what should have been probably one of the first bosses in the game, just tuned up to do more damage. It was very basic. So then we beat that, and I suppose this is a good time to drift into story. So, as usual, warning of 3, 2, 1, spoilers. So when this game was first suggested by Terra, I believe, and people started putting money towards it, it was put on the list as Anime Souls. Now, what's funny is nowadays I probably would have said no, but the reason I find this funny is because back in the day, we were in that particular period of our history where I was saying yes to everything, as long as it followed the basic objective requirements of, can I obtain it, can I run it, can I stream it, which is still a rule set that we have today, but that's basics, right? That's duh. If I can't get it, run it, or stream it, I can't stream the game, so no. But nowadays we exercise executive veto. But we didn't do that back then. So it got in. I'm like, okay, Anime Souls, sure. So I went to look it up, and now that we're in the spoilers territory rather firmly, I can tell you that the second piece of information I learned about this game was that it was in the God Eater universe. Now, if that means nothing to you, that's actually a big spoiler. It happens right before the second to last dungeon. It's this big moment of, oh my god, we find out that this veil that's been keeping them trapped within this city for we don't know how long, has actually been protecting them from the Aragami, back out in the rest of the world, the Oracle cells that have been consuming and destroying everything that are part of the God Eater setting. Now, we're not sure of the exact connecting point, but that is a rather substantial game changer to the overall setting and makes things very different. It also completely recontextualizes that barrier. because that's there to protect us. It's our safe spot to keep us safe from the death dooms. Okay, that's cool. Obviously, I'd never heard of the God Eater franchise, so that didn't mean anything to me. So I looked into the God Eater franchise. Okay. What I find most interesting is, from what I was able to determine from the behind the scenes, this was apparently designed originally, to be a prequel to the God Eater series. But based on how it's constructed, it actually makes more sense if it's actually the furthest game along in the series, and that this is trying to change the overall status quo of the rest of the series, of the God Eater series. Now, I don't know how true that is, because to my knowledge, the series hasn't moved forward past this point. And as I mentioned earlier, no Code Vein 2. That's interesting in its own right, but what's really interesting to me about the story, I actually have very little to say about the story. It's a good story, don't mistake me, it's just I don't have much to talk about. This is a uniquely well-built tragedy. We've got this horrific apocalypse that happens, and that leads to this horrible death doom of the Aragami. So they come up with the Revenant system to try and fight against that. And that leads to trying to come up with the Ultimate Revenant, which leads to Cruz, which leads to the Queen Project, which leads to everything going straight to hell. So then they've got the barrier up, so that's cool. But they've also got their own, let's call it a mini-apocalypse going on just within the range of the city. And now they've got to deal with that. The way they successfully deal with that is also horrific. I should mention that Cruz is not evil, just insane. Or not even insane, just bestial. Her mind is destroyed by the frenzy that she's going through. So that sucks. So all this stuff is horrible. And then they have to split her pieces up into other people who will then keep them locked away and be sealed away themselves, because if she was to reform, if her pieces reform, she would regenerate and we'd have the same problem we did to begin with. So not only did someone sacrifice their lives willingly and selflessly to try and save everyone, failed and became a horrific existential threat, but now, as a consequence of that, other people have to now give up their lives to keep her sealed away, all while enduring horrific agony. Then someone comes up with the attendant system. Yes, I know it's not someone invented it, but my point is the attendants are like, oh, hey, we have to go and find our successor. Okay, have fun, go find your successor. In this nightmare world where lost are slowly increasing and revenants are very abusive and usive and blah, blah, blah. Okay, that sucks. That all kinds of sucks. And there's also the problem with the fact that blood is slowly drying up, because the revenants need blood to live, because vampires. And if they don't get blood, well, they turn. When they turn, one-way street, can't come back. So that sucks. There's some humans, but they're kind of starting to run out of resources, and humans. And you can see how the whole situation is essentially just desperately trying to stay above water as everything's getting worse, and also there's an anvil on your leg. And yet, you're probably sitting there thinking, well, this just sounds like a Souls game lore. They're all Darth Doom, Death, Doom. And you're right. But you're also wrong in this case, because what's really strange here is how the characters uplift it, which leads me to the second big thing I want to talk about with the narrative. The character, all but one of the named characters are decent people, doing the best they can to try and help the situation and help others. One of the most dominant themes in the entire work is how individuals in their own minor ways, even if they can only do a few little things, are nevertheless struggling and trying to help each other to make things better. Everyone's doing that. There's a side quest where we interact with this dude who starts off as an antagonist. By the end of that side quest, he has successfully flipped it around completely into someone who is actually part of the solution and not part of the problem. There are multiple examples of that in this game. And almost everyone we meet has a tragic past or something horrific they've gone through because of everything that's been going through. Or maybe they themselves weren't exactly a good person at one point in time, but by golly, they're trying to do the best that they can now. Everyone, with the one exception. That's Mito, by the way. Mito's funny because some people compared him to Hojo, but a lot of people forget that a critical part of Hojo's character is that he's an absolute moron who wouldn't pass for a scientist on his best day. He got to where he was because of budget and politics, and I don't want to get into an FF7 discussion right now. But the point is, Mito is actually a scientist, does know what he's doing, and is just, he's just incredibly wrong and evil. And he, of course, has a great voice actress, so that helps too. He's voiced by my anime self, obviously. My glasses are even yellow. But other than Mito, everyone's legit. And I found myself legitimately caring about most of the characters throughout the course of the work and wanting the best possible outcome for them. We have a concept called the evacuation ship. It's get the good people out of the bad setting. Pretty common thing in video games. So, like, we just, okay, it's an evacuation, super transport, okay, it's an evacuation frigate. We just need so many, because we're getting everybody out of here, because so many people was cool. It was essentially everybody, except Mito, who's dead. Can we get these people into a better life, please? Please? Yakumo, can we get him out of there? I could go down the list and talk about some of the individual character points, but most of them are fairly well done, but ultimately only one note. This is probably the biggest complaint I have about the narrative as a whole, is the fact that every narrative beat in this game is something you could see a mile away. There's no nuance to speak of, no subtlety to speak of, no big, complex, in-depth storytelling. It's fairly basic. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing, even though I just said I'm complaining about it. But my point is, there's not much to say or think about it. There's nothing wrong with that, per se. There's nothing wrong with having a Voldemort. There's nothing wrong with having a Mario. There's nothing wrong with having a EO, who I just wish would put on some clothes. So, at the end of the day, I still found myself caring. It's just, I care about, Morrigan over on Dragon Age a little bit more than Mia in this game, for example. Also, if you've ever played Persona 5, playing this game is weird. You just hear everyone everywhere. It's just bizarre. That's about all I've got on this one. I do hope this gets a sequel, legit, because I enjoyed this playthrough quite a lot. If you haven't played it and you're curious about it, I would recommend giving it a go. And if you're trying to see if you're interested in the Souls-like series in general, this might not be a bad entry to see if you are. It's lacking a lot of the bells and whistles and some of the more precise changes and nuances of the other systems. The very nature of the party mechanic and the res mechanic completely fundamentally change how the game operates, and the way it does its class system changes how you progress and how you design your builds. But this is nevertheless an interesting endeavor in the genre, which I do recommend. I hope you've enjoyed. I'll see you next time.